Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Vintage Motocross Radio. I'm your host, Joe Abadi. My guest today was a pioneer of suspension technology. His many innovations and inventions helped to propel the sport of motocross to what it is today. In the mid-70s, he invented coolers for shocks, absorbers, to allow them longer-lasting performance, front forks and fork kits to improve handling. He developed the upside-down fork, which is now the suspension standard not only in motocross but in so many other motocross applications as well. His Simon's upside-down fork played a significant role in the history of motocross, of course, propelling Brad Lackey to his world championship in 1982. In the 90s, he co-founded RockShox, one of the most successful suspension companies in the sport of mountain biking, and again, he set the standard. My show today is brought to you by Vinco, Preston Petty, and Amsoil. And of course, my guest is Steve Simon. Steve, are you there?
I sure am. Nice to be here, Joe.
Oh, thank you so much for joining me this morning. And I hope my introduction was on key.
Perfect.
Oh, Steve, let me ask you this. I mean, you contributed so much to the suspension evolution in motorcycling. I'm guessing you must have been an avid dirt bike rider in your youth. Tell us about your early years and how you became interested in the sport.
So, like a lot of kids in my area, we were horsing around with dune buggies and mini bikes, go-karts in our early years. Mm-hmm. I first had a Bonanza mini bike in the late 60s, followed by a Bonanza go-kart. So that's my first tinkering was, to my parents' disgust, had to do with two-wheel and four-wheel vehicles of those sorts. And then as soon as I turned 15, I started to eye some means of transportation. Uh-huh. So as like many of us, the first day that I had my learner's permit, I got it and I was driving around with my folks. And when I was 16, the day of my 16th birthday, I had my driver's license. But I couldn't afford a car, so I decided I was going to buy a motorcycle. And I wanted it to be a dirt bike, but also street legal. And the only thing that I could afford was a Bultaco Libido 100.
So that was your first means of transportation and sort of your first dirt bike too, huh?
Right. I mean, it was a legitimate trail bike. Mm-hmm. It was a nice bike for me, particularly at that time. Although I did learn a very hard lesson. It was my first crash on the road. Ah. And that was when I came to a stop. I was very diligent about stopping at stop signs. I was afraid of the police. And I had put the cuff of my jeans over the Kickstarter by accident.
Oh.
And so when I went to put my foot down at the stop sign, unfortunately I found that I couldn't move my foot and it crashed.
I'm sorry I have to laugh, Steve, but you got to admit that is a funny story.
Yeah, that was a pretty good one. Luckily I didn't get hurt. Oh. But then I graduated. From the Bultaco, as soon as I was 16, I sold the Bultaco. I got a truck, and now my means of transportation was handled by the truck. And now I moved on to 125 dirt bikes. I had a 125 Sax, then I went to a 125 Pinton, mm-hmm. and I'm going for memory here. Then I had a Castella frame Sax, which is a local frame builder in San Jose, built a very, very light 125 that he actually lent me for a year or so. That was a great bike. And then I went on to 250 Husky 70, then a 250 Mako, RM370, 400 Mako.
So you were really into the motocross scene at that point, and it makes me think that we all had to be mechanically inclined to some degree to keep those bikes running even when they were new. What were some of the things that you remember having to either modify or tinker with early on?
On my first bikes, there was just keeping them running
Right.
was the tough part. So, so I can remember on the Mako, well, let's say the Sax powered bikes and the Mako.
Right.
The biggest problem with those bikes was just to keep them running when it was wet. That was my biggest issue.
Right.
So this is not like I didn't get my welder out or anything like that. It was a matter of just trying to keep the damn thing sealed up.
Yeah.
And then when I ended up with a Suzuki, we had problems with those just cracking the mag covers and water getting into them. It's not really a magneto, but into the electronics. So
yeah.
One of my memories is trying to build pieces to shield the components that were subject to shorting out in the water. And around here, we rode near the bay, and there was salt in the water and in the dirt, and that seemed to be something that really caused havoc on the bikes.
So I guess we could sort of say that Simon's ignition cover that became popular later on was really one of the first things that you actually made.
It is. It's one of them. So that was, I believe, in the late 70s.
Mm-hmm.
I built that, and I noticed you have a sponsor, Preston Petty.
I do.
And actually, Preston helped me. He built the mold for that ignition cover.
Oh.
So, and in fact, actually, I can't remember who told me about this type of plastic that I should use, but I remember driving or building that cover and then driving a semi-truck over it. I could not break it. I mean, it was just one of those revelations that up to that point, plastic to me was junk, but in that case, it was perfect application.
Very interesting. So who were, I mean, you mentioned Preston Petty just now. It also makes me wonder who were maybe some of your other early influences when it came to motorcycles and your experience in fabrication.
So, I guess, so fabrication and early influences, I mean, I have to say that goes back to my dad.
Okay.
Who was a PhD physics kind of guy, who very, very brilliant, but the ultimate nerd. So I think I remember seeing him with a pocket protector and a slide rule in his pocket. And if there's any younger listeners, they'll have no idea what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But he was that kind of guy. He knew how everything worked. Like if you took apart your microwave oven, he would explain everything in there. And if it was malfunctioning, he could figure it out and fix it. So that was a huge influence on me. And he was also, despite the fact that he was kind of nerdy, he was very hands-on. So I remember we went to a bicycle shop, and the bicycle shop owner, for some reason, had an old Briggs & Stratton engine. Mm-hmm. And I bought that engine from him for $3. It didn't run, and my dad and I took it apart. So that's where I learned. I guess I was around probably 13 years old or so at that time, and took it apart, put it back together. He explained how everything worked. We lapped the valves and replaced the piston rings, and I learned what a camshaft was and what how you had to align the cam to the crank to get the valve timing right, and cooled with a carburetor and a mixture. So that had to be the earliest influence. And my dad actually, he could build things with wood. If he needed to, he built cabinets and pergolas in the backyard and so forth. And he bought an apartment building, and when I was in my early teens, I had to work on the apartment building, doing everything from painting to plumbing. So that was kind of the first steps. And then I have to say that in those days, you probably remember we had metal shop,
sure,
wood shop, So I learned to weld, I learned to cast brass, I worked with wood, etc. And then I went to auto shop and learned the basics of auto mechanics. And through that time, I had, my garage was not full of metalworking tools, but I had a lot of outside contacts where I either at school or friends or had a group of older friends that had welders and so forth that I could use. And actually, in 8th grade, I was a pretty damn good welder. So I could weld. I remember one of my tests was welding on the roof or the ceiling of the welding shop building. So you had to be able to strike up an arc and have look at the ceiling and weld. Next one that I never got to was welding underwater.
Oh, wow.
I never really had the use for that in future, but that was big. And then I had a job in a motorcycle shop near my house called Trophy Cycles, and Trophy Cycles hosted the Mako team during the Trans Am. I guess that was in the 1970 or so, maybe 1969, but they came there for several years. So I met Hans Meisch, and Meisch is where the name Mako comes from.
Yes.
And then Willie Bauer, Werner Schutz, Adolf Weil, Garrett Woolsink. They were all on that team. And the KTM, I'm not sure what he does for KTM now, but do you know Selvaraj?
Yes, of course.
So that's where I met him, and he was Hans Meisch's mechanic.
Yeah.
And I hung out with those guys a little bit. I mean, there was definitely a language barrier for some of them.
Right.
But, and especially, so Adolf Weil, he basically didn't speak a word of English, but I became friends with his mechanic, and his name was Karl Heinz, really big, tough guy, but a super nice guy. And at one point, I'm kind of jumping ahead in the story, but
it's okay.
I saw how this is going back to the time when they started to move up the shocks on the Makos.
Okay.
Do you remember that era?
I do, 74, 75, and we just had Mike Chamberlain on here a few weeks ago, and he was explaining about that era too. So you're seeing these shocks moved up on these bikes, and this sort of piques your interest?
Yeah, that was interesting to me, and that was what mostly hand waving, but some of the mechanics and Adolf Weil and Werner Schutz. Werner could speak pretty decent English, actually. So they were just explaining how this worked, how they had thought of it, or somebody had conceived of it.
Yes.
And then encouraged me to get involved to do the same thing, because it was so beneficial that the factories were going to take a few years to get this worked out into production. And then they showed me the shock coolers that they had built, and I think this was the second year. And so they disassembled them. They were filling them with Bel-Ray oil, and they said that was one of the important factors was the oil. And so they and they gave me a set of these shocks too. So he said, Adolf said just to copy it and put them on the market.
Wow.
And I did.
And that was your first. I mean, Adolf obviously with the Mako. I knew you had something to do with Koni shocks and the cooling system for them. So that was really the foundation of what you did there.
That was my first product.
Ah.
Yes. And so that was an interesting story because so I was just basically out of high school at that point, and I was trying. I had done my curriculum in drafting. I sort of knew how to draw, but not really. So I did my best to sketch up what I wanted so I could have them machined. And so one of my dad's buddies was a very good draftsman, and he saw what I was drawing, and he said, "I'd like to help you with this, and I want to show you what a proper drawing would look like for this part." And he made just a beautiful drawing, and then I could take that and get it made somehow. I ended up casting the shock body, and because it had a reservoir down at the bottom,
Yes,
a little bit complicated to make these parts. And so I got them cast. I had them machined at one or two machine shops produce those for me. And in the process of this, the economy was not good, and there was a company called Aero Development that was in Mountain View, very close to my house, and I used them as a subcontractor, and I met the head of manufacturing there, and he saw what I was doing, and I told him that a Coney shock absorber would go, we disassemble the shock absorber and then reassemble it into the cooler. And it would be interesting if we could actually get the whole shock, because at that point, we just went to a motorcycle shop and bought the Coney shocks for retail price and put them in the coolers. He contacted for me Coney and ended up arranging for me as a 18 or 19-year-old kid. I got a distributorship for Coney.
Wow.
Without ever meeting anybody. There was no, I never phoned them. I just wrote them letters. There was no faxes or emails at that time. So they gave me the distributorship, and kind of off I went. I made hundreds of these products. They were pretty good, but I would say they weren't perfect because I learned that castings could leak. And I never really knew that before, but castings are kind of porous, and these things sweat oil.
Yes.
So I learned all about impregnation of castings to seal up the holes. But in the process, I met Jeff Fox, and Jeff bought Coney shock absorbers from me. So Jeff is the founder of Motocross Fox.
Yes.
And I sold him a lot of Coney shocks, and he acted as a sub-distributor. So that started that relationship, and then he asked me if I would be willing to design a shock for him, complete shock. And at that point, it was apparent that Bilstein shocks were working better than Coney's, and better than Coney's even with coolers. So the handwriting was on the wall for that product to probably be coming to an end soon. So I said yes to Jeff. I designed Fox's first monotube coilover shock, and it was amazing to me because there was an opportunity given that I didn't really have any prior shock absorber knowledge at all.
Wow.
So I really had to learn on the fly, and the shock absorber worked. It wasn't it was a state-of-the-art shock at that point just because it didn't fade. But in terms of the damping characteristics and all that, it was just a very rudimentary shock that worked about as well as an S&W or Monroe style shock.
But this is before the gasser.
This was a gas shock, so it was a single tube pressurized shock.
Okay.
The air and the oil were not separated, so this is one of the things that I experimented with, and Jeff was right there. I mean, Jeff wasn't really doing any engineering, although Jeff is a very smart guy.
Mm-hmm.
And he has got a PhD in physics, and he taught physics in school. So he was a great guy to work around, but he pretty much let me do whatever I thought I needed to do. And we ran some experiments where we separated the air and the oil with a piston, like a Bilstein, and then also ran an emulsion version, which just means we took the piston out. And what we found is after a few strokes, the air or nitrogen would emulsify in the oil, and you really couldn't tell much difference. It did change the characteristics a little bit, but just for the first few strokes. After that, it seemed to work fine. And so that was okay back then. But one of the funny stories about that shock is it sold like crazy. It was a great success for us. We made thousands and thousands of them in a very short period of time. And so one of my jobs was to contact riders, which I had done from the very beginning, had them tested. And Brad was one of the test riders, and he used them. And we had virtually, I would say, 3/4 of the field in whatever year that was, around 74, I guess. And I went to Florida. So I took the brand new Fox van, loaded up my igloo cooler with food and my girlfriend and a few parts, drove from here to Florida. I get to Florida, and I had, what I consider a reasonable amount of parts with me. And the first practice, I remember, oh gosh, I blanked on his name right now, but
What did he ride? Who are we talking about?
a rider came in. Terry was his first name, and I forget his last name. He was a factory Harley rider at one point. He came in with a leaking pair of shocks,
Mm-hmm.
and I thought, wow, that's weird. So I replaced the seals, sent them out. After the first moto, came back, they were leaking again. But not only his were leaking, but about half the field came in. And we had spare shocks for everybody, luckily. So the mechanics, God bless them, were taking the shocks off, replacing them, and giving me the shocks that were leaking. And essentially, we had an epidemic of just blown seals. And we had never seen this in any of our testing, didn't see it on the dyno. And what it was is the material we'd chosen for the shock seal just would not hold up under super high heat.
Mm-hmm.
And we hadn't experienced that level of heat until we got to Florida. And it was, even in the wintertime in Florida, it was pretty warm. So, and it was sand too, so it was very difficult. It was tough on the shocks. So essentially, I had to get, a box of seals flown to me, and then I had to replace everybody's seals, every race, every practice. From that moment until we could come up with a solution. And the solution was just to add a reservoir and add a little more oil, and then they could make it through
the whole moto.
Through the whole moto. But it was a miserable experience. So I learned something about rushing into production with something that was not fully tested. Anyway, the whole experience with Jeff was a great. I mean, he had a big influence on me. Obviously, the Mako guys did, and then later on in the game, probably the two most important guys were Alan Adler, and Alan is somebody that probably nobody's ever heard of, but he is the founder of a company called, I think it's called Superflight. He makes something that's like an old Frisbee, but it's called an Aerobee. I don't know if you've ever seen one, but it's a flying ring kind of a thing that will fly. Like, I think they've flown a couple hundred yards.
I think I've seen it, Steve. Absolutely.
So he's a friend of my dad's, and he helped me with he taught me how to calculate strengths and stiffnesses of tubes for telescoping, upfront forks.
Right.
And this is going forward to the upside down fork era, where I was trying to figure out, what materials I should use, what diameters, etc. And he is the guy that helped me figure out how to do that.
Okay. Well, we're gonna get into that in just a second, Steve. But
Yeah.
everybody, as vintage motocross became popular again, and of course they were all the rage in 1978. The conventional Simon's fork, even some factories replaced their forks on their factory bikes, on their works bike, with Simon's. When did you begin making those? And do you have any idea how many sets you made?
I made about 7,000 sets of those.
Mm-hmm.
I started producing those in '76. I think my first, the first forks I believe were shipped in '76, and that went on until about 82 or 83. I was still producing them for other usage. So that's a product that sort of tailed off in the end. After the factories came out with 43 millimeter forks, and I was starting with the upside down fork. Just the product was evolving, and I thought the upside down fork would be the real answer anyway. So,
Where was the conventional Simon's fork actually made? Where was it produced? Where was the chrome done? The casting? Where was that done?
So it was all local to Mountain View. So my shop was in Mountain View. The casting was done in San Jose, actually Alviso at Alpha Foundry.
Okay.
The chrome was done. There are a couple places that it was done, but that was done in San Jose. Babbitt Bearing was the name of the company.
So it was all really done. You were hands on with that, and it was all done in Northern California.
Right. Everything was done here. No, there was never any thought of buying anything from overseas at that time.
And now that I think about it, Steve, and it's not here in my list of questions, but if I'm not mistaken, there's actually American standard hardware in those forks.
Yeah. So everything was American at that point. I didn't switch over until later. At some point, I realized I need to go metric for everything because I started to export them. So the Simon's forks, the 38 millimeter Simon's forks, were also distributed worldwide. So we didn't have huge distributors, but we had some great guys in different countries that really bitched about the American hardware.
It just came to my mind. I've had a few sets over the years, and I've restored a few bikes that have had them on it, and I just at this moment recall that, and I figured, well, I better ask him. I got him here. So now let me ask you this, Steve. The upside down fork, as seen on Brad Lackey's World Championship Suzuki in '82, when did the development of that actually start? Because we saw him on Brad's bike in '82, but I would imagine before getting a set of forks into Grand Prix racing with one of the world's best riders, there has to be a lot of research and development done before that happened. So take us back to when you first began with that idea and the development on that.
I started in '79, just playing around with it. So I guess if I go back to the earliest thoughts were in the late '70s. I was one of those kids that scribbled on my notebook in school, drew all, I was always kind of drawing stuff.
Sure.
And I always went back and looked at old cycle newses and I forget all the names of these European newspapers, like Italian magazines and so forth. And I was aware of some of the earlier forks, like a Puch moped, Ducati Falcone, I think it was. Falcone. 54 Ducati Falcone had upside down forks. And so I was always kind of curious about that. It was more like a toy than anything else. But in around 1979, I'd been sketching some of that, just playing with it. Cliff White, who was Steve Wise's mechanic and a good friend of mine, had also suggested that would made sense to him. And I would have to give him credit for really kind of kicking me in the butt, so to speak, verbally to get moving on that. And so 79, I actually built a model, a small version with parts that I had. So I used a 38 millimeter tube because that's what I was building.
Yeah.
And I just machined an upper tube, and I had a dyno then. And so I was trying to see if I could get it to work. The first try was kind of a failure, but it was part of the learning experience. And then by 1980, I had actually drawn something that I thought was going to work. And in 1980, I had a working product. I was testing it secretly. In end of 1980, Chuck Son had tested it. Also, Steve Martin from LOP. Do you remember LOP?
Sure. Lorenz Offner. Absolutely, yeah.
Lorenz Offner and Marty Motes. And so Steve Martin was a really nice young rider then. And he did a lot of testing for me. And so that's when it happened. So 1980, we had something. 1981, I actually raced with a set of those forks in the Baja 1000. And so that was a test, a long test.
I think I have. You know, Steve, I was wondering, I have a picture of that on the slideshow that I'm showing while we're doing this. And I didn't realize that was the Baja 1000. And I did see upside down forks on the front of that bike.
Yep, that's right. So they lasted the whole race. The motor was toast, but the forks were still working at the end. So what I would when I reflect on this, I mean, the development process was very fast, and the kind of the turnover of from model to model or revision to revision. So I guess I went through 3 iterations of that fork in 9 months.
Okay.
So I can remember one iteration really had to do with the way the bearings mounted in the upper tubes. And so I got a good education in DU bushings, which are the standard bushing that most forks actually used at that time, and how to make those because there were none sized right for that fork. But those were some of the hurdles that I was jumping over. And then just how to get the cartridge to work right was a big issue. The bottoming system was a huge hurdle to try to get over. So essentially, in an upside down fork, or actually in any suspension system, at least at that time, it was almost impossible to hydraulically stop the vehicle from bottoming out with just a standard set of valve shims and so forth. So that the energy could just get so astronomical that you really needed a bottoming system, like in a conventional fork, is just essentially a tapered cone that engages in a cylinder and traps a column of oil. And then there's just a very tiny space for the oil to squeeze out. And so you're really making a cushion, a hydraulic cushion. And to apply that to an upside down fork is difficult because you don't have 2 tubes that are coming together in a way that you can trap any oil because the upper tube is on the outside
Yeah.
And so there's this challenge that you have to jump over. So that was probably the biggest hurdle to jump over. And if you're interested, I can explain that to you, because that is the fundamental key piece of the patent for the upside down fork.
Well, as much as I would like to talk about that, Steve, we've only got so much time, and I'm trying to get some questions in here that I know that the listeners are going to be interested in. Not that they wouldn't be interested in that. I'm sure they would. But here's my question: at what point do you hook up with Brad Lackey and convince him, who's on the verge of winning a world championship, and he had been on that verge for several years? How do you approach Brad Lackey and say, "Hey, I got this idea. Why don't you try it on this bike?" And to get him to say yes, because, I mean, I don't want to say he was in the twilight of his career. And to get somebody to take that kind of a risk or try something that, well, hadn't been proven on a GP circuit, as much testing as you did. How did you get Brad involved? And was there some testing going on here before he took those forks back to Europe with him in '82?
Oh, absolutely. So, first of all, I already had a relationship with Brad. He tested the shocks that I designed for Fox. He was, I mean, Brad, as you know, is a wonderful human being.
Yes.
He treated me great. And he was interested. I mean, he was willing to help people that he liked.
Yeah.
And who he thought maybe deserved some help. And so in this case, I explained to him what I was doing, and we had plenty of time. There was no rush. I wasn't pushing him. I told him, I'm interested in you testing the fork at some point. So this would have been early in 81, I guess.
Okay.
And so if I hope I don't screw this up, but essentially what we had was about 6 months of testing, if memory serves, or maybe even more. And so Stig Pedersen, his mechanic, was here. They had a van here. They were working on getting the bike all dialed in for the next year's GP. We set the forks up. We went testing just locally, and we just worked like we were preparing, for the World Championships.
Sure.
But we weren't in a rush. That was the critical point. I had different settings that I created for him. He said he wanted a mud setting, a hard pack setting, and a sand setting. We went to tracks that offered those, and within 6 months we had forks that he was satisfied with, and the goal was to go to the World Championships with the forks if they sort of passed muster for him. Yeah. And they did.
Were you there in Europe with him when he was, using those forks?
Yeah. That was my first trip ever to Europe. And so it was a fantastic experience.
Well, Steve, I'd have to imagine with the success that Brad had with those forks, that somebody, the Japanese manufacturers, they had to be trying to backdoor you on that design. And they're in Japan, you're in California, news isn't traveling as fast as it does today. Were there some infringements on your patent? And how did you manage to keep control of that?
Let's see now. So the first thing that I knew about somebody being interested in copying the fork is we would just get orders. Like Showa, for example, would just call up and order a set of forks.
So this is after Brad wins in '82,
yeah,
but this is nowhere near 1989 where they're in production and coming across showroom floors. So Showa calls you, Showa orders some forks from you around what, 84, 85?
This would have been just as soon as we had any for sale, so 83.
Okay.
I think is when they ordered them. And they actually had upside-down forks on Ricky Johnson's Honda in the Golden State Series, I think it was 85. So he had prototypes then. And then they went into production. I forget the first year they were in production, but I don't doubt you're right, in 88 or 89.
So, you sell, go ahead.
So I can explain this, that they were trying to get around the patent as far as I understood. So that was their tactic, was to design an upside down fork that just did not infringe. They never told me that, but that's what I'm assuming their practice is.
Sure.
The company that was interested in purchasing the fork, the rights to the fork, was KTM. That was the first company, and then WP probably was the first company that was in production of an upside down fork, but theirs did not infringe on the patent.
Okay.
And until later, they did license the patent and produced it sort of in accordance with my patent.
So now, when Honda and Kawasaki and other manufacturers wanted to now use your design, there had to be a licensing agreement. But I would imagine you had to go to the factories to see how they were building them and to negotiate a contract with this.
Yeah.
So how did all that go down? I mean, do you just get on a plane one day, go to Japan, and you're going to be going to all these factories, or how does that transpire?
So it started all here. So essentially, what happened is I took apart a KYB fork, and they were infringing. And at the same time, I had been talking to the Showa office in Gardena near Honda.
Yes.
And so there was some rumblings at Showa that maybe they would be interested in a license. And at the same time, KYB was infringing. So I wrote a letter to the patent department at KYB in Japan and explained that to them. And I want to give credit where credit's due. They were total gentlemen about it, and they simply agreed that they were infringing and that they would like to take a license. Okay. They didn't fight. They didn't weasel. They just agreed. So that's the first and only time I've ever seen that behavior.
So how long does licensing last on something like that? For as long as the patent, or how long does that go on?
That lasts for it depends how you negotiate it, but in my case, it was the life of the patent. So at that time, there were several years had already gone by. So they had over 15 years to go on the patent at the time. So to give you the whole story, that KYB agreed, and they came over to visit me, and we negotiated the license terms, and they said that the CEO of KYB would be available to sign the agreement at some point if I wanted to come to Japan. Otherwise, we could do it by mail. And but the gentleman that was in charge of the patent department encouraged me to come over, take a tour of the factory, and he just rolled the red carpet out for me. And luckily, I realized he was interested in flowers and trees and horticulture and all that when he was here. And I took him to the Filoli mansion in Woodside, which is not too far from me, which was just a grand estate. And that made a big impression on him. And then when I got to Japan, he just had a fantastic tour set up for me. And between the date that we came to the terms, I had started to continue the conversation with Showa, and they had kind of agreed. They knew something was up with KYB, so they wanted to make sure that a patent license agreement would be available to them, and so they kind of just followed in and said that send the agreement, and they would take a look at it. And with very little fuss, they agreed, and I went to both KYB and Showa at the same trip, signed both agreements. I got wonderful tours of both facilities, and Showa said there had never been a non-Japanese touring that facility at that time.
Wow.
But they let me see the Honda shock absorber, this Honda car shock absorber facility, all the fork production lines, quality control, all that. It was amazing.
Now, I understand that as possibly part of the negotiation, you had to take part in a very interesting Japanese culinary custom.
Yeah, it was great. So luckily, as you know, I'm somewhat adventurous in food
yes, I
consumption.
Do know.
So, but when I got to Japan, KYB rolled the red carpet out, and everything was wonderful. Food. I mean, they wanted to make sure that I liked everything, and their goal was to show me a great time and not put me in any position that I would be uncomfortable in. Showa, big difference. So they had a group of engineers that were not really hostile, but they were going to test me. This is kind of like a college hazing or something.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of drinking, a lot of challenging, a lot of food challenge. So one of the things that I had to do was take a whole fish. Luckily, it was cooked, uncleaned, and I just had to eat the whole thing, kind of like swallowing a goldfish alive. But this was a slightly bigger fish. So I did manage to get through that, and there was cheering at the end of it. So so I guess I passed the test there, but I didn't enjoy that particularly.
Well, Steve, you know, your career and experiences internationally with the suspension industry is just amazing. And it went on into the 90s where you and former Honda factory mechanic Paul Turner, you guys teamed up and in similar fashion accomplished what you did in the motorcycle suspension field. You basically reinvented the suspension for mountain bikes. A company named Rock Shock was born. And I read where at first the product wasn't all that well received by the industry. However, within 8 years, the company went public, raised over $65 million, and you had over 300 employees controlling 60% of the market. How do you go from not well received to having a $65 million company?
So the well-received part is interesting because it's very understandable when I think about it now, but you can break it down into two portions. So first of all, there was the technical side and the question if does suspension really help you on a bicycle or does it hurt you?
Yeah.
So in the beginning, people were not so sure. The suspension was going to add a pound or two. So that's, more than that, like 2 or 3 pounds. So at that point, a light bicycle was 25 pounds. So you're actually adding roughly 10% to the bike weight. And it's, it will move during pedaling. And so in some schools have thought that you're going to be burning your human energy pumping the suspension. So that technical side was one piece of it, which we addressed adequately. But the other point was that for a company like Trek or Specialized, etc., to put a major piece of componentry on their bike, they have to be assured that there aren't going to be problems. And the history of bicycles is littered with companies that produce something that actually causes a huge amount of problems for the bike companies. So the first thing we had to do is to prove that the RockShox really benefited the rider. And so when we did that by winning the world championships, or we were obviously a rider won the world championships, net over, and his bike was equipped with RockShox. That sort of turned the technical tide in our favor. And then we just had to just fight it out in the trenches to prove that we could produce something that was not going to cause warranty issues or technical, liability problems, like a fork breaking would be a huge problem. So that part was solved by just kind of blocking and tackling every day, making sure that we could deliver product on time, making sure we had spare parts, warranty, service available. I mean, that was a huge challenge to do, but we knew from the motorcycle business that we had to be able to perform those tasks. And so that made it a little bit easier for us to try pull that off. In the process, we developed what's now the ISO test for front forks, the fatigue test and impact tests to make sure that the factories had comfort that we were producing something that was a quality product.
Right. So it really kind of followed the path that the Simon's upside down fork took, sort of similar to that.
Right. Well, so I was very cognizant of the fact that a broken fork or any broken parts would be like the kiss of death for us. So that's why we got into the testing for the bicycle products very, very early. And I had been through several close calls on in the motorcycle business where, obviously the story about the leaking shocks, that wasn't that wasn't a big liability issue, but one time I had a pair of forks that Steve Wise was riding that broke the hinge bolt on the steering post.
Right.
And the fork was starting to come apart. So it was, they don't build lower triple clamps like this anymore. But at that point, I had a slit and a clamp that clamped the lower portion of the steering post, and it was coming apart. And he finished finished the race with the fork starting to literally separate. And so at that point, I was so freaked out that I had to test everything, very professionally for me to feel comfortable with it.
Yeah.
So anyway, that I hope that answers your question.
It certainly does. I mean, it's RockShox is still very big in the industry, and everywhere you go, any time you see a bicycle or some kind of mountain bike race like that, they're always very prominent. So,
right.
And today you're involved in another business called Simon's Innovations, and for the listeners, I have a picture of the machine on the slideshow, but the best way I can describe it is it's an automated milling machine, or a CNC, that's capable of reproducing the same part for hours on end without any human assistance. What exactly, Steve, is that machine capable of making? What types of companies are buying this machine?
That machine actually it's an automatic feeding system. You can think of it like a robot that feeds a CNC milling machine.
Okay.
It is not a conventional robot. It works more like, I guess you could think of it like a Pez dispenser, where you you load up a bunch of raw material, and then at the right time, it feeds one piece at a time, and the machine machines it, and then it ejects the finished part, and then puts a new piece of raw material in.
Now, I was looking at the video of it, Steve, and what is about the biggest part that it could make? Can you give us, being we're all motorcycle guys here listening and gals, what do you think is like the biggest piece you could put in there that we would be familiar with on a motorcycle?
You could probably put a motorcycle case, engine case in it, or a triple clamp for sure.
Okay.
Think about it like slightly bigger than a bread box would work, or a shoe box. It is meant to feed a conventional milling machine vise. And a milling machine vise opens up to 9 inches wide, and you could fit, a big part would be 12 inches long. But that's what it was meant to do. There is no real limit to the size that it could feed. The concept is not limited, put it that way.
Okay.
So, but the machines that I built, the maximum width was 10 inches wide and about 12 inches long was what we could feed. And pretty much any height would work, as long as I could get it out the door of the machine. So that's about probably 9 inches high.
I see. Now, your name was known throughout the motocross industry by the time you were 25 years old. You knew what it was to get your hands dirty back in those days, too. Now, in this era of technology and computers, they're at the forefront of everything, it seems. But are there any days in your life, Steve, where you're not behind a keyboard and you do get an opportunity to stand in front of a Bridgeport anymore?
I get in front of a Bridgeport any chance I have.
That's really great to hear.
So I do all my design work, on the computer now. I make things whenever I feel like it, or whenever I have the need, and so I work with my hands all the time, and a Bridgeport or a lathe is something I never lost my love to fool around with. Although the funny thing is, honestly, there's a lot of guys that are much better at it than I am. That's what really irks me. I have great ideas, and then so even at Fox, for the first production line, I built them a very rudimentary production line. I raced to put shocks together. We probably put 50 together at a time, and I was racing a young high school kid who worked for me, and I could not beat him even with the production line. He was faster doing them one by one. But anyway, my point is I'm pretty good at it. I love to do it, and the fact that I suppose going back to having metal shop in school is probably one of the things that got me comfortable doing it.
Yeah.
And it's one of the things I'm concerned with now that is not available to all the kids. And I think it's a shame, and I hope that maybe that changes at some point.
Yeah, I hope that changes too. So, everybody's not cut out to be a doctor or a lawyer or to necessarily sit behind a computer and design things. Some people are, some people were put here to do things with their hands and make really great stuff. But there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of influences. Well, there are influences on television and things, but some things they make difficult to understand, whether it's building a chopper that's 17 feet long and the kid says, well, I can't build that. So, but in the machine shop, when you're a kid, that's really where a lot of things can change for a young man, and you're absolutely correct there. There should be more of that. Steve, an hour has gone by so quickly, and I want to thank you for being my guest this morning.
Well, you're very welcome, Joe. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much again, and I hope to see you and Lori in the near future, Steve.
Likewise.
Thank you, my friend.
As soon as we get out from under this
yes.
COVID-19, we'll
Absolutely.
get together.
Absolutely, Steve. Thank you again.
All right, you're welcome. Take care, Joe.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, that concludes our show for this afternoon with my guest, Steve Simons. I want to thank our sponsors, Vinco, Keep the Ride Going, Preston Petty Products, Where the Legend Continues, Amsoil, the first in synthetic oil since 1973. And if you all get an opportunity on Wednesday nights at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, please tune in to Vintage Motocross Q&A on Facebook. This is Joe Abadi. I want to thank you all for listening. I am going to go get ready to watch Supercross this afternoon, and I hope you do the same. Have a great day. We'll talk to you soon.